It was in the early months of 1995 that a bunker was completed in Yasny Posny in the Kirov region in Russia. This was the project of Alexander Komin, who alongside his accomplice, Alexander Makhayev, spent 4 years completing a bunker below this garage in a horrific scheme forcing women into slave labour within the confines of a dungeon where they would spend years at a time. The idea being for Komin to get rich quick through the exploitation of his captors. However, Komin's aspirations went far beyond just financial gain. He envisaged in creating an insidious underground dungeon. In this dark realm, enslaved within, women would be forced to give birth to his offspring. The idea being to create generations of slaves, all bound to serve and idolize him as their leader, a truly perverse vision. I will give you a warning right now that this case is truly horrific. It's a bleak, twisted, and cruel story, so viewer discretion is advised because this is a rough one. If you like this content, please subscribe. If you are already subscribed, please like, as any interaction does help the channel grow. Thank you. So let's get into it. On the evening of July 21st, 1997, in the small town of Polani, Russia, a dishevelled, blonde-haired woman stumbled into the local police station. Her clothes were torn and her face pale with exhaustion. Her hands trembled as she spoke. She told the officer that for the past 6 months she had been held captive in a dungeon. She said she had been forced into slavery, beaten mercilessly, and forced upon many times. She also said she had witnessed fellow inmates suffer brutal punishments, some even having their lives taken. But as she told the officer of her horror story, he looked at her skeptically and dismissively said to her, "Maybe you shouldn't watch so many horror movies." But what she said next stunned the officer, because one by one she began listing the names of 5 people who had all been reported missing over the last 5 years, and in a town as small as Polani, such a number was staggering. The officer's expression switched from skeptical to shock as he began to realize that she was naming real people in real cases, ones they had long assumed were dead or simply vanished without a trace. The woman identified herself as Irina Ganishkina, who was herself another missing person, presumed gone forever, but here she was standing before them, living proof that something truly horrific had been happening in their town. Then, with shaking hands, she pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of her captor, the very man who had built the underground dungeon, the man who had stolen her freedom. The face staring back at them was that of 44-year-old Alexander Komin, and suddenly the officers believed every word. Alexander Komin was born on the 15th of July, 1953, in the town of Polani, during the Soviet era. Raised in a working-class district, his parents were labourers, but life was good, and his early years were calm, ordinary, and almost forgettable. Academically, he was neither exceptional nor troubled, and he blended into the background like just another student. But he was anything but an average person, for inside him there was something brewing. And by the time he reached 8th grade, Komin had already decided that he was done with formal education. He saw no future in it, no purpose. In fact, he had no real passion for anything. The one thing that did excite him was a career in the military. So determined was he abandoned school and began the military process. He passed the necessary examinations and began to lead the disciplined life of a soldier. But just before this new career was about to begin, he took a totally different path, one that would eventually lead to a series of horrific crimes. On the brink of joining the military, Comyn got into a bar fight with his friends against a group of other men in a brutal fight. Two of the men that they were fighting had been stabbed, and one was left in a critical condition. Comyn and his friends were all tried equally, although it was never ascertained who stabbed the men. But at just 18 years of age, Comyn's military dreams were crushed. Instead of the soldier's uniform, he was given the uniform of a prisoner. He was given 3 years to be served in a colony where the difference between punishment and just survival blurred. However, behind bars, he discovered an unexpected passion. It was tailoring. There was a sewing factory in the colony, and he found himself captivated by the intricate process of crafting garments. Stitch by stitch, he immersed himself in the discipline, and he became determined to carve out a career once he got outside the prison walls. However, as he honed his skills, there was something else taking shape in his mind. Prison was more than just a place of punishment. It was a breeding ground for dark ideas, and among his fellow inmates, he absorbed stories, tales of crime, power, and manipulation. But one story in particular really took root in his mind. His cellmate, who was imprisoned for abducting homeless individuals, had boasted how he had forced them to paint famous landmarks for him, which he had then sold for his own profit. The ability to control others so completely, strip them of their freedom just for his own personal gain, fascinated Comyn. In fact, it was a revelation. Power wasn't just about money, it was about control. But at this stage, it was just a fantasy. By the time he was released in 1974, his ambitions had transformed. He enrolled in a technical college, earning a diploma in fashion design and tailoring, hoping to carve out an honest life. But the harsh economic reality of his hometown crushed that dream. There was simply no work in this industry. No jobs, no opportunity, no future. Comyn took on whatever he could find, but none of it was what he wanted to do. For a time, he worked as a security guard. However, it was during a night shift that he met Alexander Mikhaev, who was an engineer, but was struggling just as much as he was. So two men connected through their hardship and dreams for a better life. They would pitch business ideas to each other, and soon they would become business partners, but in the most sinister of ways. Amidst the trouble of daily hardship, Comyn's mind kept returning to a story that had never left him, one that his former cellmate had told him, a man that had enslaved the homeless, forcing them into slave labour for his own profit. The idea had lingered in his mind. Maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. He began to think. One evening, he spoke to Mikhaev, proposing two dark business proposals. The first was to grow berries and vegetables in a greenhouse, selling the product at the local market. The second was to farm cats for their fur, to make keychains to sell alongside fashionable furs, a trend that was high in demand at the time. The suggestions, of course, would repulse most, but Mikhaev didn't flinch. In fact, he agreed. Bound by desperation and a lack of morality, the two men began to make their plans a reality, and they called it the Greenhouse Project. You see, Comyn had a garage, number 198, amongst a small row of private garages. At first, it seemed to them to be a good idea, the perfect place to begin their evil business. But then came the realization that keeping people captive in a garage was too risky. Their screams could be heard by passers-by, so this is where the plan evolved, that instead of using the garages itself, they had a hidden bunker underneath it, an underground prison, the construction of which took 4 years. And to avoid suspicion, they did most of their work under the cover of night. Yet as the bunker took shape, Comyn's vision turned even more grotesque. He no longer referred to it as a greenhouse. Now he called it the dungeon. It could have been one room under the garage, but Comyn wanted to keep digging. He spent lots of money on materials. He made multiple rooms. His goal was to eventually build an underground city. By the end of 1994, their dungeon was complete. The chambers stretched 8 to 9 meters beneath the earth, hidden beneath an ordinary garage. The only way in or out was a ladder rigged with a lethal 220-volt charge, ensuring no escape. To smother any cries for help, it had triple doors to seal the underground prison. Walls were lined with mattresses to absorb every scream, every desperate plea. The silence was absolute. Inside, the bunker was set up like a textile factory, with rows of sewing machines, work tables, and everything ready for the forced labourers that they would soon imprison with their dungeon complete. Komin and Mikhaev took the final step. They went hunting for humans. Out on the streets in the dead of night, they searched for the women that would become their slaves. During the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet economy had left millions of people out of work. There were many desperate people about, plenty of people for Komin and Mikhaev to prey upon. The duo knew exactly what to look for. Victims had to be reclusive, estranged from family, desperate for work and unlikely to be missed. Lost souls that were easily to manipulate and easy to erase. For weeks they prowled the streets of Polyani, hanging around train stations and marketplaces, just watching and waiting. Patience was key. They needed the perfect target. Then, on December the 11th, 1994, someone walked right up to them. It was a neighbour of Komin's, Vera Tapalava, a 33-year-old woman. She approached Mikhaev, asking for a cigarette. It began just as casual small talk, just a local woman asking about his day. As they smoked together, Mikhaev joked with her, and then asked her if she was looking for work. He already knew the answer and had seen the opportunity. He invited her for a drink and to meet his business partner, Komin. So together they went to the garage. In this part of Russia at the time, it was not an unusual thing to be drinking in such a place, so Vera saw no reason to refuse. In fact, she was delighted to accept. This could be her break. And that evening, inside the garage, Komin and Mikhaev welcomed her. They were jovial and drank shots of vodka. It seemed like they were getting along great, and it all seemed quite harmless until it wasn't. Eventually, Komin slipped a substance into Vera's drink, and it quickly took effect. Her vision blurred, her body weakened, and she barely had time to register what was happening before she passed out. They then placed her inside a large TV box and lowered her down into the dungeon. When Vera awoke, she was underground, where the air was heavy and the walls suffocating. Panic began to set in. She was trapped. Then Komin stood over her and told her straight she was no longer a free person. She would work. She would obey. She was a prisoner, a slave, and no one was coming to save her. Vera didn't give up, and she refused to obey, and she refused to be a slave. But over the next few days, she was starved, forced upon, and beaten, and strangled with a hose. It was made clear that she did not comply, and she would simply have her life taken away from her. Vera, by this point, was terrified, and she agreed to every demand put on her. Outside, Vera's family did not report her missing, but despite the efforts of the police, they assumed that she was just another runaway. It wasn't uncommon. Vera was now trapped there with no one coming to look for her. Absolutely terrifying. In the days that followed, Komin wasted no time, and he began to teach Vera how to use the sewing machine, along with the other skills that were required for the production of garments to be sold at the market. But despite Komin's best efforts to train her, no matter how many times he beat her or forced himself on her, Vera was simply not up to the task. She couldn't keep up with the precise movements that were required, and the mistakes began to pile up. The garments were flawed. She simply wasn't good enough. Frustration grew with Komin and Mikhaev. As time wore on, they began to fear that their plan might unravel before it had even begun. Komin, however, came up with another plan. He demanded that Vera give him the name of someone who was good at tailoring, and, under the weight of immense pressure, Vera suggested an old friend of hers, a woman that she'd grown up with. She worked as a dressmaker from home. Her name was Tatiana Melenkova, a 35-year-old woman. Vera gave the address of Tatiana, and Conan went over. In early January of 1995, Conan made his way to Tatiana's apartment and knocked on her door saying he had potentially some work for her, something which is very hard to come by at the time. By a stroke of luck on Conan's part, Tatiana's boyfriend was home at the time. That was Nikolai Malik, who amazingly had been a fellow cellmate while Conan had been in prison, and this legitimized Conan's claims, and he couldn't believe his luck. He invited them over for a drink to discuss the terms of the agreement. With his business partner Mikhaev, the couple were both thrilled to accept the invitation, and unsuspectingly they joined Conan for what appeared to be a harmless gathering. As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed, but then Conan secretly administered the substance into their drinks, and quickly the paralyzing grip took hold, and in no time they were both unconscious. Tatiana was taken into the bunker. Meanwhile, Malik proved to be an issue. Conan knew that Malik was aggressive and would be a problem when he woke up. Conan believed that Malik would never willingly submit to their will, so keeping him alive wasn't an option. So Conan and Nikhaev got rid of him, so they stripped him of his clothing and dumped him in a frozen, desolate field. The brutal Russian winter will soon finish the work that they had started. To deceive the authorities, they left his clothes nearby. Officers knew that in the extreme cold, hypothermia sometimes induces paradoxical undress, which is when the body is freezing. The person actually feels overheated and usually ends up removing their clothes. It was the perfect cover. When Malik's body was discovered, police assumed it was just a tragic accident. A drunken man lost in the snow, stripping off his clothes in his final moments before succumbing to the cold. They didn't see it as a murder, and just like that, Conan and Mikhaev had got away with it. Tatiana's family did report her disappearance, but as in Vera's case, the investigation went nowhere. It appeared to the officers that the women had just vanished. I suppose there was no way for them to know that they'd actually been enslaved in a dungeon. Tatiana was forced to work 16-hour days, making dressing gowns, underwear, and had to finish 32 bathrobes every day. And this was grueling work. Vera couldn't help with the production of the garments, so instead helped Tatiana with everything she needed to keep the bunker clean. The men also used Tatiana's body to pleasure themselves, although they did force themselves on both women, and it was Vera's job to do so more often. Tatiana and Vera were tormented by death threats and were fed menial food like potatoes and bread and water, and sometimes the women would not even get this, and they would be starved for days. They were only allowed to bathe from a bucket once a week, and there was a second bucket for them to defecate in, and this bucket was only emptied once a week. And during all this, the beatings and essaying continued. For Conan and Nikhaev, demand was booming for their product, and the profits began to flow in, and the two men decided to expand their operation. Conan wanted to dig more rooms. As of now, it was 3 rooms and a workshop, but he couldn't ask Vera to dig, as she was too weak, and Tatiana had to keep up her grueling schedule. So Conan decided they needed a male captive, and so Conan and Mikhaev began their macabre search. And so on the 21st of March 1995, they found Yevgeny Shivnov, a 37-year-old homeless man who had been struggling with alcoholism and had fallen on hard times. As per their normal routine, they offered him work, but first wanted a chat in the garage to iron out the finer details of the job. Once there, they began to shot vodka, and once again one was laced with the substance, and before he knew it, Yevgeny woke up in the bunker, his legs and neck shackled. Conan told him he was to dig in the bunker. He wanted to make room for another factory and expand their business, and he would be working as a slave, and if he didn't comply, his life would be taken from him. At first, like the others, Yevgeny was defiant and refused to simply become a slave, but after a thorough beating, he soon had to submit. In an effort to demonstrate his usefulness, he revealed that he was a trained electrician with 4 years' experience. But this news set off alarm bells in Kolmin's mind. With expertise in electronics, Yevgeny posed a significant risk. He had the capability to disable the power to the electrified ladders, which could lead to the escape of all the captives. This new information presented a significant complication for Kolmin, and one he would not overlook. Kolmin made the grim decision that Yevgeny had to die. His fate was sealed. Kolmin's cruelty knew no limits. After reading through reference books and technical materials, he decided the best way to kill him was with an electric chair, a device of absolute horror and control, a machine of death, and so he built one. It was crude, but horrifyingly effective. A simple wooden chair, stripped of all comfort, bare wires wrapped around, waiting for its victim. To activate it, 2 switches had to be flipped simultaneously, and Kolmin knew exactly who would switch them. His captive women. This was more than just execution. This was domination, a test of obedience, a way to break them completely. When the time came, Yevgeny was stripped naked, his wrists and ankles tightly bound, the wires dug into his skin. He was allowed a moment to make peace with what was happening. Then Kolmin turned to Vera and Tatiana. "Do it," he ordered. "Kill him." But Tatiana refused. Even after everything, she would not become a murderer. But Vera obeyed, for fear of what might happen if she didn't, and so she flipped the switches. The room lit up, and soon there was the smell of burning flesh. Yevgeny died instantly. His body was taken up to the ground floor and to an isolated part of a forest where his remains were eventually found. However, the authorities knew of his history with alcohol and dismissed it as an accidental death. No investigation, no suspicion. Once again, Kolmin had got away with murder. After this, Kolmin turned on Tatiana with ferocious violence for her defiance, and he beat her within an inch of her life. And now he began to favor Vera, and eventually came to trust her. Vera was not much use in the dungeon to Kolmin, so he decided to use her in a different way. She was allowed to leave the bunker, as long as she would find him more people to enslave, or do any other tasks that he asked of her. She would have to return in the evening, but this was better than staying in the bunker all of the time. Tragically, she became instrumental in the continuation of their heinous cycle. On July the 16th, 1995, 36-year-old Tatiana Katikova found herself in the dungeon. Despite holding a job, her wages were unreliable, and desperation had driven her to steal a cake for her daughter's birthday, and she now had an upcoming court hearing for the theft, and she would likely receive a fine and possibly even incarceration. So when Vera, under the manipulation of her enslaver, offered her a job opportunity, Kuzikova, hoping to pay her way out of her legal troubles, quickly accepted. She was desperate, but what she didn't know is she was being led into depths of Kolmin's sinister lair in a similar way to how Vera herself was ensnared. She approached Kuzikova, who was an old friend, and told her about a man who had plenty of work to offer, and it played out the same. They went to the garage, drank a shot of vodka, and before she knew it, she awoke in the dungeon. When Kuzikova awoke, she was deep inside the bunker, but she was different. Despite the harrowing condition, despite Kolmin's brutal beatings, despite being forced upon, she refused to submit. Her spirit remained unshaken, and she fought back. She was also a beacon of hope for Tatiana, who by then was slipping into despair. After now spending 6 months in the bunker, she was losing her will, and she spoke of ending it all. After all, in her mind, it would be better than what happened to Yevgeny. Kuzikova refused to let that happen. She made an amulet for Tatiana, which became a symbol of freedom. She wrote words of encouragement on the wall, small messages of defiance, promises that one day they'll get out of this situation, and her strength was fueled by one thing, her daughter, and no matter what, she would see her again. Over the next few days, Tatiana showed Kuzikova how to make the robes, and what was demanded of her. They both worked 16-hour days, non-stop, and at least 32 bathrobes a day were expected of them. While she was learning her new job, Kuzikova meticulously observed the bunker's layout, looking for any weaknesses. She noticed the electrified ladders. She tried to find a way to cut the power to them. Realizing that this was not possible, one thing she did notice is that every time that Cormin entered, he disabled the electrical system, unknowingly giving them a chance to escape. Kozikova had engineered a plan with Tetiana. The next time he came down would be their chance to make a break for it. Once he came down, Kozikova locked Kumin in one of the rooms using a frying pan handle. This was now their chance of freedom. Kozikova and Tetiana made their way up the ladder, but what neither of them knew was that there was a locked iron door at the top of the ladder, sealing them inside. They tried with everything they had to get that door open, but they had no chance. As this was happening, Colin broke down the door that had kept him locked inside, and one by one he pulled the women down from the ladder. He was furious. How dare they try and escape? Not only would they ruin the business, but this would lead to his arrest. He administered the most serious of punishments. He choked them with a hose, burned their hands with a large candle, and beat them till they nearly lost consciousness. He was looking around the dungeon, thinking what could he beat them with next. The cruelty that they both endured was horrific, and it just showed the inhumanity of their captor. Coleman then gave them an alternative in regards to punishment. They could either have their mouths grotesquely slashed from ear to ear, like a Chelsea smile, or they could be branded with a tattoo on their forehead with the Russian word for slave. Faced with this cruel choice, the women opted for the tattoo, a permanent reminder of their captivity, but one that spared them from further physical abuse. Coleman then tattooed the phrase on their foreheads and also under their eyes, and Tatiana would later say how the pain was unbearable when she was being tattooed below the eyes. This was done with crude instruments, so you can only imagine the pain. To stop any further attempts at escape, Coleman resorted to even more extreme measures. He welded shackles to the bunker's wall, and each time before coming down the ladder, he would turn on a light, and once this came on, the women would have to put the shackles round their necks and throw the keys on the floor in front of them, ensuring their complete and utter helplessness. Under these horrific conditions, the production of the garments continued relentlessly. Tatiana laboured to the point of exhaustion, barely sleeping or eating. But the business was doing well, and Coleman wanted to add yet another slave. He sent Vera to go and find someone, but unexpectedly, when Vera left this time, she did not return. But Coleman wasn't worried. He felt confident that the terror that had been instilled in Vera was enough to silence her forever. He believed that no matter where she fled, she wouldn't dare to expose him, so he made no effort to find her, and his assumption proved correct. Vera chose not to reveal the horrors that she had endured. She attempted to disappear into a new life, leaving the other captives alone to face the brutalities without any hope of being rescued. With Vera now gone, Coleman and Mikhaev spoke again about what to do, and as usual the plan was to search for new captives. Coleman set his sights on markets and train stations again, and in early 1996 he encountered a woman who fitted his vile criteria. She was shy and had a nice figure and looked desperate. Coleman began to talk to her. He lured her to the garage with the promise of food and a place to rest, and most importantly, employment. His method was the same: a drink laced with substances, followed by abduction to the bunker. The latest victim of this horrific plan was yet another Tatiana, 27-year-old Tatiana Nazimov, who, unbeknownst to Coleman, was struggling mentally, having fled her home years prior due to her issues with it. Despite his efforts to train her on the sewing machines and garment making, Tatiana 3 didn't have the skill or mental awareness for tailoring Coleman did have some use for her still. She would simply become his intimate slave. She would have to please Coleman and Mikhaev whenever they chose. A horrific existence. But Coleman still needed labor, so he again went out in search of a new slave. It was then that Coleman, whilst wandering the markets, bumped back into Vera. He was happy to see her. They spoke, though Vera must have been terrified. But Coleman seemed unfazed, that she had run away from the bunker. But not only this, he made her an offer. He said that if she came back to work for him, he would give her a cut of the sales, and all she had to do was keep the bunker a secret and run occasional errands for him. Vera was still living a very poor lifestyle, and she agreed, and even offered to bring a new slave to show her loyalty. Their next captive was 22-year-old Irina Gudaskina, a young mother who had desperately been trying to find a new flat with her boyfriend. She went alone to view an apartment when she met Vera, who claimed that she was handling the lease for the landlord. Irina was struggling to find steady employment. Her lack of education and no work experience made securing a job almost impossible. Vera quickly saw this vulnerability and exploited it, promising Irina that she knew someone who could find her work. Irina, hopeful and trusting, took the drink that Vera had offered, unaware that it had substances in it, and almost immediately she passed out. Vera and Coleman together moved her body into the darkness of the bunker. When Irina woke up hours later, she was in a state of panic. But then she noticed Mikhaev. They had literally played together when they were young, and relief flooded through her as she pleaded desperately for his help, hoping that he would save her. But instead of rescue, Mikhaev betrayed her in the cruelest way, violently forcing himself upon her. The betrayal must have been devastating, but the horror did not stop there. Coleman had never intended to keep Vera around, and after she had brought Irina to him, he wanted no partners to share his profits, and she had served her purpose. Now he planned to make an example of her, to instill fear into the remaining captives. He tied Vera tightly onto a table, usually used for sewing garments, gagged her mouth, and began pushing needles deep between her fingernails whilst beating on her. The pain was unbearable, so intense that Vera slipped in and out of consciousness. But Coleman wasn't finished yet. He handed Tatiana a syringe filled with antifreeze and ordered her to inject it into Vera. Tatiana froze, not wanting to do it, but terrified of what might happen if she were to refuse. Tatiana tried, but she could not find a vein. Then Vera offered to drink it herself. Coleman agreed and poured a glass of the substance. Vera drank it, but it was not enough, and she had to ask for more. For 15 agonizing hours, Vera's body was ravaged by the poison until she finally succumbed. Once she was dead, Coleman and Mikhaev casually dumped her body into a nearby river, ending yet another life and covering their tracks once again. By March of 1997, Tatiana Nazimov's health began to deteriorate. She was suffering badly from the symptoms of leukemia and the worsening state of her mental health. Nazimov desperately needed professional health care, something impossible to obtain within Coleman's dungeon. So to him, Tatiana had become a liability. The other captives begged Coleman for mercy, pleading that he release her for treatment. They argued that in her fragile state, nobody would believe her if she decided to speak out, but Coleman was unmoved by the compassion. He saw only risk, and he was determined to eliminate the threat that she posed. Coleman cruelly starved Nazimov for days, watching her weaken to the brink of death, and when her condition became so critical, he injected her with the antifreeze, ending her life in a final, painful way. Nazimov's remains were planned to be taken during the night to a local morgue, but on the way, Coleman noticed some people heading in his direction, so he simply dumped the body in some nearby bushes, where her remains were discovered that very morning. And even though the authorities notified her family, her troubled history and life on the streets brought them to the conclusion that her death was simply due to her untreated illnesses. Once again, no investigation was launched. Another life lost, another crime that was hidden in plain sight. Back in the bunker, Coleman's fascination with Irina gradually formed into a distorted form of romance. She was young and seemingly compliant, exactly what Coleman desired, and it was then he did something that he'd never done before. He threw a small celebration within the bunker, bringing sweets and treats in an attempt to charm Irina. Irina was terrified, but she quickly found herself faced with a critical choice. The other captives begged her to play along, seeing it as their only chance of survival and perhaps eventual escape. Reluctantly, Irina agreed. She began to write poems of longing and love, and Coleman, in his delusion, thought that they were written about him. When Coleman read the poems, he was deeply moved, and they brought him to tears. He cried in Irina's arms and said no one had ever written a poem for him before, and he fell obsessively in love with her. He began to come to the bunker every day, not only for work, but for dates with Irina, and all the while the other women are slaving away. And while Coleman and Irina would have intimacy in one of the rooms, but as they did, Coleman would place a mirror so he could see the other women at all times, to make sure there were no attempts at escape. Soon, believing that Irina was genuinely the one, he began revealing his master plan, a nightmarish underground kingdom of enslaved women, forced to bear his children generation after generation. He envisaged Irina by his side, his official wife and queen, obsessed with conceiving a child. Coleman repeatedly assaulted Irina, resorting to grotesque methods like artificial insemination using a turkey baster after his natural efforts failed. Using her growing influence, Irina convinced him that a bunker was no place to conceive his offspring, and they needed somewhere else, somewhere better. I played along, said Irina, and almost immediately he expressed his love and said he wanted to marry. I saw the chance and bargained with him. I said if I were to marry him, he would have to stop hurting the other women, even if they failed to reach his expectations. To my surprise, he agreed. He started bringing us normal food and even asked Tatiana to sew me a beautiful dress. I didn't even have my own clothes, and he began to start taking me upstairs occasionally, letting me breathe fresh air again. But he quickly warned me not to scream, because no one will hear you anyway, he told me. So I made the painful choice to play along, pretending to care for someone who was a murderer. A man that forced himself on women, a complete maniac, was unbearable, but I knew that it was the only way to survive. He kept pressing me, repeatedly asking if I loved him, and somehow I kept saying yes. And to this day, I still don't know how he never suspected a thing. By April of 1997, Coleman had become so convinced by Irina's act that he decided to take her out of the bunker altogether. He brought her to live with him in his flat, and suddenly Irina's nightmare continued, but this time in the open, disguised as a normal life. To understand how surreal this was, you have to picture Coleman's life outside the bunker. He was completely mundane. No job, living on benefits, and sharing a flat with others who knew nothing about the monster he actually was. His family and friends had absolutely no idea of the horrors that he was hiding. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, he brings this young woman to live with him. Coleman kept a constant watch over Irina, never giving her a single moment alone. He monitored every single word she spoke to family and friends, forcing her to maintain the facade that everything was perfectly fine. One day, while out walking together, the new couple ran into Irina's parents, and Coleman immediately put the charm on, acting polite and well-mannered. He even suggested they all get together soon and become properly acquainted. Not long after, they met at Irina's parents' house. But before they arrived, Coleman made a chilling threat. He carried a knife and warned Irina that if she didn't convincingly play along, he would murder her parents right in front of her, before ending her life as well. At the gathering, Coleman asked Irina's parents for their blessing, putting on a show of sincerity and warmth. But he didn't stop there. In manipulating them further, he persuaded them to give them custody of Irina's daughter, who had been living with Irina's parents. He convinced them that they were going to be a happy family, and Coleman moved from his property into a smaller one, so the three of them could live together as a real family. Irina's daughter even started to call Coleman Dad. Hard to imagine how much Irina must have been seething inside, but she had to play along. As their wedding day approached, Coleman bought Irina's dress, and the date was set. But fate intervened. Unexpectedly, Irina's grandfather passed away, and with Coleman being deeply superstitious, he took it as a bad omen and decided to postpone the ceremony. In this delay, perhaps lay a tiny part of hope for Irina. Irina's desperation to escape grew by the day, especially after Coleman had revealed more of his horrifying plans for the women, still trapped in the bunker. She had been preparing their meals, which Coleman had been taking down into the bunker, but one day he demanded that she poison their food. He wanted them dead. He no longer wanted the bunker. He wanted to live a normal family life with Irina, even though his version was in the most twisted of fashions. Irina refused outright, defying him despite the danger. But Coleman had already anticipated this and had a backup plan which was even more terrifying. He intended to bury the women alive, filling the bunker with soil, leaving them trapped underground, effectively burying them alive. Irina knew that she was running out of time. She had to find a way, and fast. Irina's chance finally came on the 21st of July, 1997. Coleman was forced into hospital for a minor operation, meaning for just a few precious hours, Irina and her daughter were essentially free, something that they had been waiting so long to experience. All those unbearable days and nights, pretending to love a murderer, a monster, a maniac, had finally paid off. Irina knew that she had to take this opportunity. Without hesitation, she took her daughter and rushed straight to the police station. And as described at the beginning of this video, officers dismissed her story as a wild fantasy until she began listing the name of the missing people and her fellow captives. Suddenly, they took her seriously. Irina quickly revealed everything: where to find Coleman, the exact location of the garage, and of course the dungeon. She also told them about the ladders leading down, that they were rigged with electric current and explosive. She warned the officers they went down there without disarming the ladders. Not only would they die, but the captives too, and the dungeon would be destroyed. Police raced to the hospital and arrested Coleman, taking him immediately to the bunker. At first he insisted that it was all fantasy, but when they brought him to the garage, he casually invited the officers to climb down, knowing full well the trap that waited for them below. In his mind, he thought if the officers went down and the explosives went off, he would have a chance to make an escape. But the officers were not fooled, and demanded he disable all the traps immediately. Moments later, Tatiana and Kuznetsova emerged from the bunker, stepping into the daylight for the first time in 2 agonizing years. As they took their first breaths of fresh air, at long last, their nightmare in that dungeon had come to an end. But tragically, their struggles didn't end with freedom, and the next part is probably the saddest part of this whole story. After they had been rescued, police issued a public plea. They wanted to raise about $400 for removal of the humiliating tattoos that's been branded onto the women's faces. But nobody donated. So many people were financially struggling at the time. But also, due to a lack of empathy, much of the public actually believed that the women were responsible for the crimes themselves. Instead of compassion, Tatiana and Kuznetsova were met with suspicion, and they were never recognized as the true victims, the heroes as they were. Unable to find work, the women resorted to begging on the streets. doing whatever they could to simply survive. No one would hire them, and they had become permanently marked by their horrific experiences. A few years later, Tatiana's struggle ended in tragedy. She was discovered dead in a back alley. She had succumbed to exposure, desperately struggling, sleeping amongst rubbish in a desperate attempt to stay warm. Yet out of the tragedy, something good did emerge. Tatiana's death made national headline, and a famous Russian singer heard about their plight. Moved by their story, she located Korsakova and paid for her tattoo removal and provided her with a place to live. However, Korsakova died a couple of years later, and she experienced a sudden heart attack, meaning both women passed away within 7 short years of escaping the bunker. Irina fared better. Despite enormous difficulty, she did manage to rebuild her life, securing a job and a home for herself and her daughter, and over time she did recover. Today she enjoys the love of her supportive family. Coleman, however, revealed his cowardice after his arrest. At first, he claimed he'd been helping the women. He said, and I quote, "These had been unemployed, homeless women, and I gave a place to live and a steady job." I kid you not, he was painting himself as some sort of saviour. He continued, "Every day I had to think about them, think about feeding them." Even though he didn't, when this tactic failed, he switched to blaming Mikhaev, claiming he'd been forced into everything, laughably claiming that Mikhaev would murder his whole family if he refused. The revelations had left Coleman's family and friends in complete shock. They could hardly comprehend that the quiet, seemingly harmless man that they knew had been hiding such horrific secrets. And finally, in June of 1999, Alexander Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Mikhaev received 20 years. Coleman said during the trial, and I quote, "Of course, a crazy idea like this would not come to a normal man, but still, I think I am normal." Just 1 month after the sentencing, Coleman ended everything in his prison cell. Good riddance. It really is truly one of the most horrific stories with a tragic end. But at least Irina found happiness at the end. Thanks for watching. And again, if you like this content, please subscribe. If you're already subscribed, please hit like, as your engagement will help the channel grow, bring you more of these types of videos. Remember this, however bad it is out there for you, at least you're not in that dungeon. So look up, stay safe, keep going, and may peace be with you always.